So the cells of the immune system. So there are some key terms that I want to go over before we get into that. One of them being innate immunity, right? So this is your immunity that's encoded in your DNA. It doesn't change. You are basically born with it, right? And this is what we've started talking about, right? So your book divides it into 2 chapters, innate and adaptive, right? Another book I use does 3 chapters. So these involve stuff that we're going to talk about next time, like your anatomical barriers, your sensory systems. We've already kind of mentioned how we can recognize patterns. We know when tissue's been damaged. We've seen how phagocytic cells work, and we have seen the inflammatory response. These are all innate, right? You're born with this. This is encoded in your DNA. You know how to do this. Before you're even born, some of these things you do. As opposed to your adaptive immunity, which only, I forget in the animal kingdom where the separation is. Invertebrates do not have adaptive. So it's vertebrates and up that have adaptive immunity. So when I say adaptive, what does that mean to you guys? What's a synonym for adaptive? If you're trying to explain it to somebody else, if something is acquired. If you're adapting to something, do you stay the same? No, you're constantly what? Changing, right? So this provides protection that improves over time. As you're exposed to new antigens, and this involves your B cells and your T cells, what we call your lymphocytes. And that's my favorite part of immunity. Not to say that innate isn't super cool too, and saves your ass more often than not. It's this adaptive ability that's pretty amazing when you think about it, like how often we basically win the lottery with our immune system. So some terms that I've already said, one of them being antigen. Antigen actually means antibody generators, right? Because when we were first studying the immune system, we found antibodies. They were very easy to find. They're very large proteins, and a large number of them circulate in your blood, right? Because your blood is your superhighway to get everywhere in the body. So they were able to purify these and study these, and they found that they would bind to specific antigens. And as we know today, it is actually the antigen, this foreign substance, that causes your body to make an antibody. So these are molecules that react specifically with either an antibody or an antigen receptor on our lymphocytes. And so these are foreign substances that your body is typically recognizing. But sometimes when you're dealing with disorders, sometimes the body recognizes self-antigens, things it shouldn't recognize as being dangerous. And we'll talk about that when we get to the last topic in immunity, which is disorders. So first we got to learn how it works, and then we're going to talk about when it doesn't really quite work right. And so antibodies are these Y-shaped proteins that bind to antigens, to specific antigens. And we'll go through in detail all the different types and classes of antibodies and all the different parts. And we'll do drawings. I'm going to buy some new markers. I'm going to make you guys draw on the board. Melanie's like, yep, I'm going to be absent that day.
Yeah.
You can draw a stick figure. You can draw a stick figure. You're not going to be graded on your level of ability to draw. Maybe so. All right. Yeah, Kat will be the director. So these are always found in normal blood. I wonder if these boards are metal in the back. We can get some magnets. You won't have to draw. We'll see. We'll play. Definitely going to get you guys more active. This sitting passive thing is getting old. All right. So these cells, right, that we briefly looked at last time, are always found in normal blood. But they're going to increase, as we talked about last time, due to infection. Because again, they're going to be the ones that run to the scene and gobble up and try and destroy. So it makes sense that when we are dealing with an invasion, an infection, we're going to need more of them. Now, some of these guys are pretty specific to the adaptive immune response, like your lymphocytes, right? They're the main players that allow us to have an adaptive immunity. Some of them, like your dendritic cells and your macrophages, are really important for that first line defense, right? Especially those resident macrophages that gobble up the bad guys as they invade into our tissues. But they can go one step further. Instead of just eating it, they can share this information with the adaptive immune response. So as it says, some of them can play dual roles, right? They're a major component of our innate immunity, our first line of defense, but they also help in activating and sharing this information with the adaptive immune response. All your blood cells, including your red blood cells and the large megakaryocytes, which break into what we refer to as platelets, which aren't actually cells anymore. This is why in anatomy and physiology they say formed elements instead of cells, because platelets aren't in fact cells anymore, right? They're a cell that broke up into a bunch of little pieces. Although very important, red blood cells and platelets, right? We're going to focus on the white blood cells. But all of them, all those cells that are found in your blood and the pieces of the once big megakaryocytes, platelets, all originated from your bone marrow and a process referred to as hematopoiesis from hemopoietic stem cells. So these are stem cells that give rise to all the blood cells. How does the body know then that stem cell, when it divides and then starts to differentiate, which cell it should become? How does it know it needs to become an erythrocyte or a white blood cell or, for that matter, a neutrophil within the white blood cell group? How do they know this? Intuition? They just know. I was born to be a red blood cell. Yeah, genes are going to be expressed, right? So information in the DNA is going to be utilized to differentiate that cell into whatever cell our body needs. But how does our body communicate that to the stem cells? Right? Because our body is going to determine this, right? So erythropoietin is given off by your kidney, right? When it senses that you need more red blood cells. What is that? It's a hormone. But we don't deal with hormones with the immune system. We deal mostly with, what's that chemical signaling called? No. Cytokines. And so there's a whole group of cytokines that are collectively known as colony stimulating factors. And so each factor, each colony stimulating factor is going to tell those stem cells, hey, we need neutrophils, right? You need to go down that lineage and make neutrophils because we've got a bacterial infection that's just going nuts. And we need the super killers. We need those neutrophils. So in general, right, red blood cells, also sometimes referred to as erythrocytes, carry oxygen, so very important cells, right? Just aren't immunological cells. Platelets, which are fragments of the megakaryocytes, as I said, these are an important component of blood clotting. You can almost consider them like little sandbags, right? We can use them to plug up holes in blood vessels. They also contain enzymes inside of them that when they burst, they activate the clotting cascade. So those guys are really important to our protection. But what we're really going to focus in on are the white blood cells. And that's kind of strange. I mean, red blood cells, it kind of makes sense why they're called red blood cells, right? They're red. White blood cells, when you spin down blood, create this little buffy white layer. Because they're not as numerous, right, as the red blood cells. You get this big, huge red blood cell layer. Then you get the little white blood cell layer, little white coat. And then you have all the plasma. So that's actually why they're called white blood cells, because they do actually, in large numbers, look white. Another name for them is leukocytes, but remember I cautioned you guys against using this one because a lot of times people confuse leukocytes with lymphocytes. Not a good idea. There are 4 general categories that we lump the white blood cells into. We have our granulocytes, which the 2 website pages you guys read, right? Their granules look like what in their little diagrams? They look like freckles. Aren't they cute? Look, did I put them in my PowerPoint? Yeah, look, see? Looks like freckles, right? They're so cute. I love those websites. Okay, so you have your granulocytes, which are all filled with granules, and remember all their names end in what? Nope. They're all filled with granules. Fills, right? Neutrophils. What's the other one? Basophils. Eosinophils, right? There's 3 of them. Then you have your mononuclear phagocytes, right? So these are your big eaters. Their nucleus stays intact, right? This is your macrophage, or what are macrophages called in your blood? Monocytes. And then dendritic cells are sometimes put in their own category, as you see there. Then lymphocytes, there are 3 of them. 2 of them we refer to by just single letters. T cells and B cells, and then also natural killer cells. So if you watch that video, which I'm not going to, it's not a waste of time. I'm not going to utilize our time in class to show it to you. But I highly suggest watching him. He's really good. I'm still not on the internet, am I? Or not on. It says I'm connected. I just can't get onto Canvas for some reason. Aha, because I'm not really connected. That's why. Aha. Dana, I think I figured out how to fix why you can't get on either, maybe. Like how I did with Annie and one of my other students. So next time we'll try and you don't have to use your spot either. I forgot you were using your spot too. Okay, come on. You're supposed to remember my password. I'm supposed to remember my password. I have to make it so complicated. All right. So modules down at the bottom. So videos and animations. This guy is really good. This one right here. It's a really good summary of the immune system. And so he talks about natural killer cells and how they were named in 1973. which was the year I was born, so that's really cool too. But, you know, that's a really cool name, isn't it? Natural killer cells. And it basically tells you what they do, right? Why couldn't they have named all the cells really awesome names like that, right? But, you know, a lot of them, again, their names have meanings to them, right? And if you know the meanings, then it can help you understand them. So for each of them, right, so for granulocytes, we need to know that those are neutrophils, eosinophils, basophils. The mononuclear phagocytes, we're talking about monocytes, which turn into macrophages in your tissues. The dendritic cells, your lymphocytes, B cells, T cells, and natural killer cells. But the really important thing, right, other than their different categories, is their functions. What do they do? So, as we said, they all come from the bone marrow, the hemopoietic stem cells, and colony stimulating factor is going to determine which way they go down the different lineages. So colony, they're talking about like a group of cells, right? You're going to go into a particular group. So it splits off into these two lineages, right? And then within the lineages, they'll go to the different types of cells. These cells down here will be found in your tissues, right? So mast cells are found in your tissues, macrophages are found in your tissues, dendritic cells, effector T cells, and plasma cells. Where you're going to see your lymphocytes, B cells and T cells, and remember in the blood, the usual staining we do, you're not going to tell the difference between these guys, or even a natural killer. All the lymphocytes are going to pretty much look the same. You can distinguish a monocyte, and then each individual granulocyte are distinguishable if you look at a standard differential, a blood smear stained, to be able to observe the different white blood cells under the microscope. And then, of course, you'll also see red blood cells and platelets, those pieces of that megakaryocyte. So, again, notice the commonality here. They all contain granules, right? And they're actually named based on how their granules stain. And they have the multilobe nucleus, right? The deformed nucleus. Where the other ones tend to have a pretty round nucleus, although monocytes in particular tend to have that indentation to the nucleus. But usually nice, beautifully round nucleus for your lymphocytes. So granulocytes, named after the fact that they contain cytoplasmic granules that stain, right? So it's not that these other guys don't have granules, right? They just don't stain in the staining procedure. So, and as I said a moment ago, right, I love the picture. They kind of depict their granules as this guy's little freckles. So another tip that's helpful is that all these names end in "fill." So I always think about being filled with granules. And as the name implies, right, neutrophils, their granules tend to be neutral staining, which means they tend to, for the most part, blend in with their cytoplasm. You usually can't, you have to look really tough, or you have to have a really good stain to differentiate them from their cytoplasm. These guys are their main job, right, is to engulf and destroy bacteria and other material, right? They're our main phagocytic cells. Basophils are involved in allergic reactions and inflammation reactions, especially when they release histamine. So histamine's a vasodilator, right? It's going to cause blood vessels to become leaky. Mast cells are similar to basophils, but they're found in your tissues. So they're similar in that they release things like histamine, but you're not going to usually find them in your blood. Eosinophils help with parasitic worm infections. And they're also involved in allergic reactions, but they're the ones that quiet down what basophils start. They produce several antimicrobial substances as well, and they produce histaminase. So this is an enzyme that breaks down histamine. So basophils will release it, right? We'll get the inflammatory response, but then to stop that response when we need to, eosinophils will release histaminase. Basophils are named after the fact that their granules stain basic, so they're like purple, bluish color under the microscope. Eosinophils stain with the dye eosin, which is a reddish dye, so it looks reddish or orange, the granules. And again, that's because each one of them contains different substances in those granules. So I like their drawings too for these guys. So the mononuclear phagocytes, again, these are phagocytic cells. Macrophage means big eater, right? So, I mean, look at him. He looks like he could eat a whole bunch, right? Or these guys don't look quite as scary, huh? The dendritic cells. Monocytes is the name of a macrophage when it's circulating in our blood. When it leaves the bloodstream, right, that's when it develops into the big eater known as a macrophage. So there is a belief that monocytes can actually differentiate into dendritic cells as well. But there is a precursor lineage too in the bone marrow where we can directly derive dendritic cells. They're named after the fact that you see how I have these long cytoplasmic projections? So almost like dendrite cells, right, that have the long cytoplasmic extensions. That's how they got their name. And they literally will take these and reach out and grab onto pathogens, to antigens, and bring them in. And again, these guys are going to digest it by phagocytosis. Both these cells are going to do that. Macrophages, as I mentioned earlier, right, some scientists discovered them in tissues and gave them names, and then come to find out, it's like, oh, no, it's just a macrophage that happens to be living in the liver, right? So Kupffer cells is the name given to macrophages in the liver. But they're, all these cells are the same. So I guess when they got to the lungs, I guess they really were able to recognize at that point, they're like, oh, it's just a macrophage that lives in the lung. So they named them alveolar macrophages to denote that they are found in the lungs. Where mesangial phagocytes, right? When they named them, they didn't realize that, this cell is found all throughout your body, this cell type. I can never say the name of the one in the brain. So we have them in our brain, right? And then we have them all throughout the body. Dendritic cells, a good, kind of nickname for them is scouts. Because these guys will travel. Right? So they'll grab stuff from in your tissues and they'll travel to sites where there's large concentrations of your lymphocytes because they're going to share that information. So just like a scout that goes out ahead of everyone else, scouts out what's out there and then brings that information back to home base, the same thing for dendritic cells. They're going to carry that information back to the lymphocytes and present that information to them wherever it is that's the closest location for them from the site where he encountered that antigen. So he can get that adaptive immune response going. So he's like, here, look, I found this. What do you think about this? How are we going to deal with this invader? Have you seen him before? So they usually develop from monocytes. Right, but they do have their own lineage as well. And then we have some of my favorite cells, which are your lymphocytes. And these guys are the reason why we have an adaptive immune response. Adaptive immunity could not exist without them. So these are your B cells, T cells, which are very specific as to what type of antigens they recognize. They generally reside in your lymph nodes and lymphatic tissue, so that's where they get their name, right? Because we found them in these locations. Natural killer cells are also lymphocytes, but their difference is that they lack specificity. They can't specifically identify specific pathogens, where T cells and B cells can. But as their name implies, right, they're really good at killing when we need them to. So there's some specificity seen, right? You have a lymphatic system that we'll talk about that helps bring antigen and these lymphocytes into contact with each other so that we can respond. The interaction is specific. So notice this lymphocyte is specifically recognizing this one specific bad guy with its receptor on its surface. Where these other guys, notice their like little crown they're wearing is a different shape. This one doesn't recognize them. It's only recognizing the one that he specifically can interact with. Helper T cells, as the name implies, they like to help, right? They help out. And they have receptors on their surface as well, just not shown here. And then you have cytotoxic T cells, or sometimes referred to as killer T cells. And these guys are really important for what we call our cellular response, because they can recognize when our cells are infected, right? So they're very important for our viral defense, right? For when viruses get inside of our cells, and when bacteria are intracellular, they get inside, or even our own cells behaving badly, right? When you have cancer cells. They have receptors. They can recognize when these cells are not normal and when they need to be eliminated. So a little bit more about neutrophils. So we know they're eaters, right? Their granules don't stain very well, but they contain enzymes and antimicrobial substances that are very important to their job. Other names you'll sometimes see them called by are polymorphonuclear, right? And poly meaning many, morpho, the shape, nuclear, their nucleus, right? So again, they tend to definitely have the most deformed nucleus you'll see. Leukocyte, which of course means white blood cell. Neutrophilic, again, that neutral staining. So also sometimes abbreviated, therefore, PMN, for polymorpho neutrophilic cells, or just polys for short. They are the most numerous, right, in normal blood. Their numbers definitely increase with infection, especially if it's a bacterial infection. They're called into our tissues during inflammation. They're not normally there, right? They come on scene when we have an inflammatory response, when a bacteria has breached the barrier and the signal has been sent. As we said before, these are the greatest killers. Their enzymes and antimicrobial substances are very powerful. The most powerful of all your white blood cells. They have a short lifespan, only a few days. And when they release the contents of their granules, they die, right? And so I refer to them as your suicide bombers. Because as I said, that's really powerful stuff that they're releasing. It's going to cause some serious damage. And it'll cause damage to anything that's near it. Bacteria or you, it doesn't matter. They can also, as I said last time, right, they can shoot their DNA out of their cells, again, killing themselves. But to use that DNA, that very large molecule, to actually create a net to help trap stuff in the area. So these are pretty awesome white blood cells. Macrophages, these are your big, big eaters, right? They're going to gobble up lots and lots. They're derived from the monocytes in your blood. They're sentinel cells. They're always present in your tissues, right? Always on guard, always on watch. Ready to gobble up anybody who gets in. So they're scattered throughout the body. There are pretty high concentrations in your liver, in your spleen. And believe it or not, your spleen is the only organ you can live without. If you lose it, right, due to damage or illness or infection, you never will hear of anybody getting a spleen transplant. Although it does a pretty awesome job, mostly eliminating your poor, worn-out red blood cells, right, that are those long-distance truckers. Hence why you need a lot of macrophages in there to help gobble up and digest those used red blood cells. But also it helps filter your blood for any pathogens that may have gotten into your blood. So then you're at greater risk without your spleen of blood-borne pathogens, but you can survive without it. It's not vital to life, but your level of protection is definitely decreased. The taking care of those used up red blood cells pretty much gets taken over by your liver if you lose your spleen. Your lymph nodes, which drain the lymph that goes through your lymphatic vessels, has a lot of these guys because, again, this is your sewage. This is the fluid that leaked into your tissue during inflammation is now being sucked up by the lymphatic vessels. And so you want to filter that fluid before you put it back into circulation, right? We don't just dump stuff right into the river, although some people do. You don't want to do that in your body. Your peritoneal cavity, your abdominal cavity. Why would you need a lot of resident macrophages on guard there? What mostly takes up this part? Other than, this good old greater omentum that's pretty great on me. What's in there? Intestines, right? Where digestion is happening. Small intestines. Huge, right? They're small in diameter, but they're enormous, right, in length. What's happening there? You eat food, right? You digest it. And then the wastes go out, but what happens to all the stuff you digested and break down? It gets absorbed into your bloodstream, right? Into the body. Well, stuff that you ingest, is that sterile, clean, like no problem? You don't have to worry about anything like invading from there? Not hardly, right? Lots of stuff could get in, right? And so we have lots of macrophages standing by just in case, right? And you even have sections along your gut, right, where you have collections of not only macrophages but B cells and T cells right there, right? On scene, dendritic cells, constantly you have cells that are sampling. You have M cells in your gut that are on all the time taking stuff in and giving it to the macrophage and going, here, check this out. Just make sure. Make sure we know what's going on down the pipeline just in case he crosses the line, right? We want to know all about him, right? You're constantly surveying all the stuff that goes through the system. Your immune system is. That's a major area that could be a problem, a source of invasion for the body. These guys are much longer lived than your neutrophils, right? Hence why they can be big eaters. They can live weeks to months or even longer. And they can regenerate their lysosomes, right? Where a neutrophil, if he uses up all his lysosomes, forget it, he's done. He's dead, right? Where macrophages can keep making lysosomes. So they can keep eating. They can be activated by other cells and cytokines. Remember, cytokines are those chemical messages. and other chemicals released by the body. So these guys aren't super killers to start out. They can become more powerful killers when they become activated by other cells or signaling by the immune system. So if they go into that phase where they're classified as M1, these are your killer macrophages, right? And we saw this in that granuloma that we looked at last time, right? When we're more bactericidal, it's because the way these cells are acting. Where M2s are more healer macrophages. But again, they're not set in this status, right? They can bounce back and forth. A macrophage can go from a healer to a killer to a healer, right? Just depending on what's needed at the time. Recall that these guys can form giant cells, right? Fuse together when they're not able to eliminate the pathogen. And then what other cell type comes online, and that mask is called a granuloma now. So you have giant cells, right? And then one other cell type comes in, and then that classification goes to granuloma. Who would usually help out macrophages, or at least try? It's a lymphocyte. T cells. T cells. And so this is showing dendritic cells, but macrophages can do this too. So they're going to, just like we saw with phagocytosis, right? They're going to have some receptor be able to grab onto the pathogen. They're going to bring it in by phagocytosis. They're going to digest it. But that's not all. They're going to pick it up in a special molecule and present it on their surface. They're going to present it to cells like helper T cells. And notice again, he's showing his receptors here, right? And now he's become activated. He could then go activate a macrophage that's dealing with the same pathogen and help it get better at killing. Or this T cell could then go activate a B cell and get it to produce antibodies against the pathogen that they're dealing with. So that's pretty much all he does, is run around and help, like shake hands. Yep, that's the bad guy. This is what you need to do, right? He doesn't really do anything. He just runs around and confirms with everybody about what everyone else is going to do, right? But we need his help, right? So remember, we really want to, home in on these functionalities. This is a good summary, but we're going to we've already gone into more detail here with these guys. I'm trying to remember how much more. This goes into cell communication and that. Yeah. We'll keep going. Yeah. Y'all look too tired. If I communicate with you right now, you're not going to be communicating anymore. All right. I get the hint.